In 2018, a hiker set out on a walk through Sycamore Canyon in Arizona, expecting a challenging but beautiful day on the trail. But when he found himself lost, dehydrated, and overwhelmed by the heat, his desperate attempt to signal for help would ignite one of the worst wildfires in the area's history, leading to devastating consequences for both the land and himself. On May 27, 2018, 37-year-old Philip Powers set out on what was supposed to be a straightforward solo hike. A resident of Arizona, he was familiar with the region's harsh landscapes and had experience on the trails. His plan was simple: a day-long trek through Sycamore Canyon, a remote wilderness area in central Arizona. While not an expert, he expected an uneventful trip. Stretching nearly 21 miles, Sycamore Canyon is Arizona's second largest canyon, a vast and rugged landscape of deep gorges, towering red rock cliffs, and narrow slot canyons carved over millennia. Unlike the Grand Canyon with its millions of visitors, Sycamore Canyon is a remote and undeveloped. No roads, no visitor centers, and no maintained trails. It is a destination for experienced hikers and backpackers seeking solitude and adventure, but it's also an unforgiving environment where extreme heat, scarce water, and rough terrain can turn minor mistakes into emergencies. With these challenges in mind, Powers embarked on this hike. He began his solo trek along the Cabin Loop Trail, a route classified as easy to moderate. The 17-mile-long trail winds through remote wilderness, passing several historic sheep ranchers' cabins along the way. Expecting a one-day hike, he carried less than a gallon of water, a few snacks, a battery-powered cell phone charger, a sleeping bag, a hammock, a machete, a large knife, and stove fuel. It was an odd mix, some items useful, others seemingly unnecessary for a day hike. That summer had been particularly hot, with little rain to relieve the dryness of the land. On the day of Powers' hike, temperatures were exceptionally high. Fortunately, the path was lined with Douglas firs and ponderosa pines, offering some much-needed shade as he moved deeper into the wilderness. Despite the heat, life thrived in the canyon. Mule deer moved through the underbush, peregrine falcons soared overhead, and rattlesnakes lay camouflage against the rocky ground. Eventually, he reached Taylor Cabin, one of the old sheep ranchers' cabins. At this point, he was 14 miles into his hike. Confident in his progress, he continued beyond the cabin. However, as he moved forward, the trail became less defined, the vegetation denser and the landscape more rugged. The striking scenery turned disorienting, rock walls felt closer, and the overgrown path twisted unpredictably. Beyond the shaded groves, the canyon was harsh and exposed. At first, he wasn't concerned. He had followed the trail in, so he should have been able to follow it back. But retracing his steps proved harder than expected. The landmarks looked different in reverse, and the faint path had all but vanished. For an hour, he searched for any familiar markings, but as the dense brush and fading daylight closed in, he made the difficult decision to turn back. By the time he reached Taylor Cabin again, it was 6 p.m. Now, 14 miles from his car, Powers faced a new challenge: isolation. He attempted to check his phone for a map or to call for help, but there was no signal. This meant more than just being able to contact anyone. Without service, he couldn't access his map app, and since he hadn't packed a physical map, he had no reliable way to navigate. Gone were the chances to check for alternative routes or locate a ranger station. To make matters worse, his supplies were dwindling. He had just half a liter of water left, along with a mango and 2 oranges. Fortunately, inside the cabin, he discovered some additional food. There was an old jar of peanut butter, some jam, and coconut oil. While it wasn't much, he ate everything he found, trying to regain energy. As the night fell, his situation grew more difficult. First, he encountered a rattlesnake inside the cabin. Worried that it would bite him in his sleep, he managed to kill it and quickly toss it outside. Then, exhaustion and dehydration caught up with him. His legs cramped severely, likely due to the lack of water and the strain of the day's hike. Under the intense Arizona heat, A person hiking 18 miles would typically require 2 to 3 gallons of water to stay properly hydrated. With less than a gallon from the start, Power's reserves were dangerously low. Aside from the cramps, dehydration also causes fatigue, dizziness, and confusion. Knowing he was stranded and far from help, anxiety started to settle in. The cramps were agonizing, leaving him unable to move for extended periods. He cried out for help, hoping that someone, anyone, might be nearby to hear him. But in the remote canyon, there was no one. Desperate to attract attention, Powers decided to start a signal fire near the cabin, hoping rescuers or rangers might see the smoke. But in Sycamore Canyon, fire is a dangerous tool. The land management agencies heavily restricted open flames due to the risk of wildfires, especially in summer when temperatures exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit and vegetation is dry and highly flammable. Still, with no other options, he tried. Using a lighter, he managed to ignite a small fire, but it burned out quickly. With no immediate signs of help, he returned to the cabin to try to rest, knowing the next day would bring even greater challenges. In the morning, Power set out once again, determined to cover the remaining 14 miles back to his car. The previous night had left him exhausted, but he had no choice. He had to keep moving. The morning air was still relatively cool, but as the hours passed, the temperature climbed rapidly, soon reaching 91 degrees Fahrenheit. His limited supplies were now gone, the last of his water and food had been consumed, leaving him with nothing to sustain himself through the brutal conditions. As he pushed forward, his body began to fail him. The intense dehydration set in quickly, and with it came an overwhelming sense of weakness. The cramps that had tormented him the night before returned with even greater severity, forcing him to stop and seek shade. His muscles seethed painfully, his strength dwindling. At this point, Powers later admitted to authorities he truly believed he was going to die. Desperate to stay alive, he resorted to drinking his own urine in an attempt to rehydrate. But he knew that wouldn't be enough. With no way to call for help and no energy to continue, he made a fateful decision. He would try to start a signal fire again. The night before, his efforts had failed, but this time he took a different approach. He gathered dry foliage, brittle twigs, and stacked them around the base of a dead tree, ensuring the flames would catch and climb. He knew this was risky. Fires could quickly spiral out of control in such dry conditions, but the alternative, dying alone in the canyon, was worse. Using his lighter, he ignited the fire. Unlike before, it spread quickly, flames licking at the brittle wood and climbing higher into the air. There was no turning back now. Powers could only hope someone, somewhere, would see the smoke. Not wanting to wait in place, he continued staggering along the trail, leaving the fire behind. He took no precautions to control its spread, and in his absence, it began to grow. Hours later, a distant sound broke the silence, a small aircraft passing overhead. Spotting his chance, he waved a piece of orange fabric in the air, desperate to be seen. But he didn't stop there. Determined to ensure his rescue, he set yet another fire as an additional signal. This time, it worked. This time, luck was on his side. The crew in the aircraft spotted the rising smoke and his frantic signaling. Help was finally on the way. Rescuers reached him and transported him to a hospital where doctors diagnosed him with severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, and acute renal failure. Most concerning of all, he had developed rhabdomyolysis, a condition in which damaged muscle tissue releases harmful proteins into the bloodstream, a direct result of his extreme dehydration and physical exertion. Had he not been rescued, this could have killed him if he had gone untreated. Powers was weak and in recovery, but he was alive. After more than a day lost in the canyon, he had been saved. But his ordeal was far from over. The fires he started had done more than signal for help. They had ignited something much bigger, something that would have devastating consequences. After his ordeal in the wilderness, Powers resumed his life, believing he had done what was necessary to survive. He recovered from his harrowing experience and moved on, but in 2021, 3 years after the incident, he was confronted with the legal consequences of his actions. The state of Arizona charged him with 7 misdemeanors related to the fires he had set. While the first and third fires burned out without spreading, they were still considered criminal acts due to the strict fire restrictions in place at that time. The second fire, however, was far more serious. The flames he had left behind quickly grew into a wildfire that consumed more than 230 acres of forest, burning through dry vegetation and spreading uncontrollably. It took over a week to fully contain and required extensive resources. More than 100 firefighters, 5 helicopters, 4 ground crews, an air attack team, and a fire engine. The financial toll of the response was enormous, but the environmental damage was even worse. The wildfire destroyed historic trails, disrupted local ecosystems, and displaced countless animals from their habitat. Powers did not deny his actions, but he pleaded not guilty, arguing that the fires were an unavoidable survival measure. He genuinely thought he was going to die that day on the trail. His defense pointed to a legal precedent. In 1984, a hiker named Robert Launder got lost on Mount Lemmon near Tucson. Stranded on a rock ledge, he cleared a path of land and lit a signal fire in a rock circle. That fire, like Powers, quickly grew out of control and turned into a full-blown wildfire. Launder was initially sentenced to 3 years of probation, but his conviction was overturned on appeal, with the court ruling that he lacked criminal intent despite the fire's severity. Powers and his lawyers attempted to use a similar argument, that without the fires, he might never have been rescued. However, Judge Camille Bibles rejected the comparison. She ruled that Powers had acted with reckless disregard for the surrounding conditions. Unlike Launder, who had taken precautions to limit the fire spread, Powers had ignited dry vegetation around a dead tree and then abandoned it, making no effort to contain it. The fact that Arizona was under strict fire restrictions at that time only worsened his case. Additionally, the court took into account his general lack of preparedness. He had embarked on a challenging hike with no map, no compass, no flashlight, and no reliable means of signaling for help beyond his phone. To make matters even worse, Powers had not even been on the trail he originally intended to hike. Instead of following the Cabin Loop Trail as planned, he had mistakenly entered the Taylor Cabin Trail, an entirely different route nearly 2 miles longer and 50 miles away. Unlike the moderate terrain of Cabin Loop, Taylor Cabin was classified as a strenuous and difficult hike, making his lack of preparation all the more dangerous. The court found him guilty. Powers was facing 3 years in jail and a massive fine for his actions. In 2023, he appealed the ruling, but the decision was upheld. However, the judge revised his sentence. Instead of prison time, he was sentenced to 7 years of probation, a mandatory hiking safety course, and a $293,000 fine to cover the costs of the firefighting efforts. Given the enormity of the fine, Powers was allowed to make a monthly payment of $200, an amount that, at this rate, would take him 122 years to fully repay. Powers set out on what he believed would be a manageable solo adventure, but the wilderness is unforgiving, and his mistakes quickly piled up. While those fires may have saved his life, they also led to widespread destruction, and now he is paying the price, not just in fines, but in legal consequences that will follow him for years. Hiking isn't something to take lightly. Many underestimate how quickly a simple trip can turn into a survival situation, and a wrong decision can have lasting consequences. But what do you think? Was Powers rightfully held accountable for his actions, or was his punishment too severe given that he thought his life was in danger? Let me know in the comments. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. I put in a lot of effort into my videos, and although my videos don't have the same quality as other bigger channels, I truly aim to give you the best experience possible. I would really appreciate it if you can like and subscribe to my channel, so that one day I can offer you a much better experience. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.